Well, it's good to have you here, and I am delighted to be with someone who I've known for quite a few years, who has always been a source of inspiration and connection for me, Tracy Budd. And Tracy has had a dedicated practice for a number of years, and recently, kind of with early retirement, took on a very interesting question. And the question being, is it possible to do home practice at the same level or degree as if being on retreat? And there's some fascinating observations that he's had over time. So Tracy, thank you so much for your time. It's great to have this time with you. I'm always interested. I keep coming back to this whole allegory of kind of the hero's journey, and of course, the hero's journey is you're going along in stasis, a steady state, and then there's a calling. Like there's something. Usually, it's kind of a searing thing that kind of like wakes us up to becoming more awake. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit of kind of like, because you've been so immersed in your practice for a good while here, like who were you as the before? Give us a little bit of background in terms of, you know, what we're all waking up out of conditioning. Just maybe a little bit out of your upbringing and what you've done professionally, that sort of thing.
Um, can I say something about conditioning first? Because you just brought that up.
Absolutely.
So I don't think we're awakening out of conditioning. We just have a different conditioning. So it's always conditioning, but it's a more enjoyable conditioning. But so what I would say is that well, let me just give a little bit of the background of the practice, and then I'll say what sort of spurred the last push, and then that I think will answer your question in a little broader
Perfect.
sense.
That's great.
So I started meditating. In fact, I think through you. I think you were the first person I contacted about meditation many years ago. I started meditating on my own and started to have some interesting experiences. And then I realized that I probably needed some help. And, I contacted you and found you, and, we spent a lot of time together. So that, very grateful for that. But I also, I have been practicing for many years since then. So it's probably been 12 years or so, 12 to 14 years, something like that. And during that time, I've had a pretty consistent practice. It's been probably an hour and a half to 2 hours a day consistently for that time. And I've been on a number of retreats and had a number of interesting experiences, but nothing like what has happened in the last few months. So
So
go
can
ahead.
you say a little bit about sort of the demarcation of the last few months?
Yes.
Because, basically, can maybe just share a little bit like what kind of work did you do?
Oh,
And then, when you decided to step down and kind of engage a little more deeply into daily practice.
yeah. So I was a satellite systems engineer. So I come from an engineering background. I have degrees in mathematics and computer science. So I'm a pretty pragmatic person. Um, so I retired 2 years ago, and for the first year or so, I was basically miserable. I had various incidents in my life that had uh, caused my life to be a little more miserable than usual than at that time. And I also, I would just to give more of a background of me. I've been depressed most of my life. I think most of that was a result of trauma, and that has resolved itself through this practice. And I may mention some more about that later. So I was in a pretty miserable state when I actually decided that I was going to start meditating 4 hours a day. And the reason that I decided to do that is because that's essentially when I'd been on retreat. That's usually right about the amount of time that I would spend in meditation or formal meditation on the retreat. And I was trying to see that if I could get into jhana, and not be on retreat. And it turns out that that did occur and that was possible.
So just to pause here, if you can say a little bit um, about jhana, like what is jhana and what are the conditions that provide the possibility of that experience?
Yeah, without going into too much detail, there's a lot of books on that, but basically, jhana are states of consciousness that are not dependent on sensory input. And, in those states, there's also an abeyance of the hindrances so that they're generally pretty joyful and pleasant and peaceful. And there's various levels of jhana, and there's a lot of discussion about that, but they're basically very pleasant states. They're very healthy states. They're states of non-greed, so they're pleasant, but they don't have the usual characteristics of creating, although you can get greed around jhana. They're usually not as bad as other sensory desires.
Got it. So just to kind of slow this down a little bit for those who might be, curious around the state of jhana, is that in order to kind of get that sense of absorption,
Yes.
where it's more of an internal state that's less dependent, and it's also kind of the suspension of the hindrances,
Yep.
as you said, which is really the suspension of anger, judgment, ill will, blame, the suspension of craving, wanting, desire, the
Yep.
suspension of restlessness and worry and hypervigilance, the suspension of sloth and torpor, the suspension of doubt, the suspension of self-criticism. That's a lot to clear away.
Yeah. Yeah. It
To, so
feels very
to,
good usually.
yeah, exactly. It's got to feel great. So, so there are two things that I would love for you to share about.
Okay.
The first one is that accessing accessing who you are in the absence of all those mind states obviously requires some diligence and some technique, but also there's a lot of clearing out that occurs in that fundamental aspect
Yeah.
of practice. So you mentioned earlier that a lot of your misery was kind of like based on trauma.
Yeah.
And I know that you actually, before engaging formally into meditation, you did a lot of exploration
Oh, yeah.
around trauma. How did that link the fact that you have explored trauma, how to work with trauma, etc.? How did all that work kind of play into this deepening of your meditation practice?
Well, it's interesting. I I had been in therapy several times and had, some degree of success with that. However, therapy really can only get you so far because it's always within the context of a narrative. And a lot of the stuff that's going on at deeper levels just doesn't have a narrative. It's not, it doesn't have a story. So it's not verbal. And so it's not really accessible or addressable through verbal context. Um, Having said that, so some of it can be addressed through verbal context, some not. And I actually have a good friend of mine who is a psychiatrist in the military who specializes in trauma. And we've talked about this a great deal and what happened in sort of my experience. So, just to describe a little bit about what happened. When I first started meditating 4 hours a day, I wasn't using a particular technique. And what happened is that the memories from my past that were traumatic would arise in my mind. And so for 4 hours a day, for about 4.5 months, there were traumatic memories arising in my mind. And what would happen, and as I discussed this with my friend who's a psychiatrist who treats this kind of thing, is that these memories would arise in the context of some level of comfort and peace. And so what happens in that context is that the traumatic memories get associated with some pleasantness and peace. And then when they get restored back into long-term memory, there's more calm, there's more acceptance, there is less pain that is associated with those things. And that's actually what how trauma is treated. Like they associate, the traumatic experience with a pleasant experience after that traumatic experience has been brought up, and then it gets consolidated. It's called memory consolidation, I think, and then it just goes back into storage. So the thing that was different with me is that there was no one guiding this. So the mind itself was choosing what to address. And it just kept addressing over and over, just going through the entire inventory of all of the things in my life that were particularly troublesome. And this went on, like I said, for about 4.5 months. And then after that, it started to calm down. And there really wasn't much else going on. I was just kind of sitting and being relatively calm. And that's when I actually started to do a more structured practice so that I could um, try to push my practice further.
Something I certainly notice from many people when they start meditating is they have these moments of peace, these sort of like glimpses into who they are in the absence of those five mental states. And there's just that rush of like, oh my gosh, I've arrived, I've found something. And then, as the joke goes, when you meditate, you feel better. You start feeling your trauma better, your grief better, your sadness better. And for many people, as one of my teachers said, that most people stop practicing precisely because it's working.
Yep,
You know,
that's right.
so um, so for when we experience fear and helplessness, most of us, you know, we move into some reactive phase. So, the kind of the self-preservation mechanism, kind of takes over. Um, Were there times when you were finding your mind kind of displaying the inventory of your traumatic memories that it ever felt too much? Or were you familiar enough with the kind of the narrative that it allowed you to stay with it?
Yeah, I would say that I think the terminology would be that I have a fair amount of emotional bandwidth because A, I've been in therapy. And the other thing is that you and I did a lot of focusing around a lot of really unpleasant experiences, which basically, which just please ignore my cat, which basically meant that there was more ability to just accept what was going on as opposed to struggle with it or do anything with it. So that's actually the key. Is accepting things is actually the key in some strange sense.
It's to kind of interject one of, part of one of my takes is that, that when something arises and we have some aspect of mindfulness, as I say, maybe ad nauseum, it's sort of letting go of trying to figure it out and instead to get more familiar with.
Yeah.
And so what I'm imagining is as you were like unearthing those memories and kind of getting the story, but also getting in touch with their somatic roots, like kind of how they lived on the inside, that through that familiarity, when they arose again, there was still a charge, but there was enough of the observer or the witness or something like that, that actually allowed you to kind of bear the presentation of those memories. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I would say that's only really sort of initial phase of the process because ultimately those experiences have nothing to do with the self or a me or anything like that. And that's not apparent when the memories are coming up and maybe in the initial stages of things, it seems like those are somehow associated with a self, but they're ultimately not.
So this is where I think I want to kind of throw in like a cautionary thing for those of us who are practicing, because I think there are times when we have this sense of like, I'm just gonna bear down and muscle through this. And we talk about this the context of rain, to recognize what's arising, to ask if you can allow it or accept it, and then if you can, to sort of investigate, look into its nature, and call on loving presence. And for many of us at different times, when we are aware of a traumatic memory, and we really ask, can I be with this right now? Sometimes, if you ask sincerely and deeply, which you should, the response might be no. This is too much. It's just flooding. It's overwhelming. I really, really can't be with it. And the strategic thing then is to let it know you see it, step away. Another time, different conditions would allow you to be with it. So you spent 4.5 months, in this sort of experiment of like, I'm going to putting these hours into just being, basically having this display or this presentation of your trauma history.
Hmm. Yep. Yep.
So, uh,
It
so,
was,
so
yeah.
I'm appreciating the scientist in you, you know, that can say, well, isn't this interesting? Let's here's the plan, here's the strategy. I'm going to stay with this. I'm going to observe this. I'm going to be dispassionate about what I observe. Were there times where you found yourself um, kind of caught in doubt or caught in reactivity, or were you able to kind of inherently trust the flow of it?
Well, it's funny because what seemed to happen in this experience for me is it became apparent that my mind knew what it was doing, and it seemed to have a purpose, and it seemed to be doing this all by itself. And it also was fairly apparent that it was making things better, like that things were getting better, even though these were experiences that were arising. And these experiences were not it's not the first time that I had these memories, so it was the same memories arising, and it was in the context of a very calm experience, which makes it a lot easier to accept those things than if frankly, if you're depending on the mind state, if you're in a calm mind state, it's a lot easier to see what's going on and not be particularly upset about it. And to be clear, there's no person that's doing that. So when there is a calm state that is in evidence, then it is just simply an easier state to be in when these things arise. And it's not like there's someone who's deciding to deciding to accept these things. It's just that they become accepted in this more calm environment just automatically.
So that's, boy, there's so much in there, and I just kind of want to unpack that a little bit because, to me, it's what I love about it is the translation from like the words on a page that make sense, you know, but then translating it really into experience. And so if I can play back a little bit, so on some level, you were watching the mind kind of like play back the memories, but you also were aware on some level like that there was some, I don't want to put words in your mouth, there was some kind of inherent intelligence that was
Yeah.
kind of just sort of like releasing them, and
Yeah.
that's where I find who was it, Father Thomas, I don't know, who was his name, I can't think of his name right now, but he said he described meditation as the practice of consent, you know
Yeah. Yeah.
like, oh, okay, well, look at this,
Yeah.
and consenting to what arises. But then what I'm really sensing is because you've stayed with it, that you could actually begin to recognize that there was sort of an intelligence around this process, and you began to see that there was sort of like, again, I don't want to read in here, but like this fluctuation of like, here's the release of a memory on full display. I can see it. I can also sort of like get its somatic roots, and then it changes. And then when it changes, like there's more space, there's more wholesomeness. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say that's true. And I just wanted to be clear that I don't think there's anything special about this mind, that I suspect that all minds have this capacity. And I also suspect it's related to what happens when we're very young, is we actually construct personalities. So these minds actually build up the personality. So this thing that was going on in my mind was really, it was just restructuring the personality that it had already done once before, but in a different context.
Right. But there's a big difference between, as Stephen Levine said, his definition of meditation is that meditation is one insult after another. You know?
Yes.
And the reason why it feels like an insult is we're identified with this self-concept about how we're supposed to be and what meditation is supposed to be. So when you sort of shift from, I'm just going to stay, I'm going to stay here and I'm going to watch the display and kind of allow it. Like there's some kind of a what seems to me like a widening and a broadening and a heightened sense of and maybe even like a trust in the process. Would you
Yeah.
call it that you became more trusting?
Yes, there's a trust that develops as a result of seeing the results, essentially. So it's a funny thing because the acceptance also is not a something that can be willed. It occurs, and it occurs from the experience of continuing the practice. So, and that kind of reminds me, there's something that I wanted to bring up about all this is that I think it is, in order to get the real benefits out of Buddhism or meditation, that it should be considered an exercise like training to lift weights or training to run. It's not so much a philosophy, it's not so much a religion. It has philosophy in it, but basically it is a training, and it is the training and experience with the mind that actually changes things. It's not reading a book. Reading a book won't do it. Reading a book gives you the structure in order to do the things that will change the mind, but the the reading itself, you don't learn Buddhism in the same sense that you learn like math or history or something. It's something you have to practice, like lifting weights or running or fencing or something like that. Even though it's a mental practice, it's a practice.
I couldn't agree more. That I remember being on a month-long retreat, and it was like week 3, and then suddenly it was like, oh, this is a training. I'm, I'm actually
Right.
training.
Yes.
I'm training attention,
Yes.
and there's something about that that I find powerful as well.
Yeah.
So you're training yourself, but then there's also again, not to beat this thing to death, but the whole idea of like it's so this whole beautiful teaching on verified faith, you know,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
here's the teaching, and for me it's like okay, so everything born out of causes and conditions is subject to change. Well, okay, that makes sense, but then the question becomes, can I verify that? Can I validate that in my experience? And then that builds a very deep sense of kind of that sense of verified faith. So you spent 4.5 months basically observing this display of memories and like all the different factors that kind of shaped your personality. So then what?
Well, I would first want to say a little bit about the training and a difficulty that I think people have, is that there is a belief that you can just tell the mind to do something and it will do it. And it's as though people will like say, okay, I'm going to pick up this 1,000-pound deadlift now. I'm just going to pick this up. And it does not work that way. The mind is only going to be able to do certain very minor things. And it seems like you can tell it to do more, but that's not really true. It can only do like little tiny things. And it's absurd how small the little things that you can get the mind to do. What you can get it to do more with practice, but it seems like you should be able to do more. And I would caution to have low expectations of what the mind will do. Because yeah. All right, so I just wanted to put that out there, and then I'll go into the next.
Well, and just to say, for I think many people, certainly myself, like they get that on retreat. You know,
Yeah.
you walk in. I would be well rested and just on walking meditation and just thinking as I'm heading into the next 45 minute sit, I'm gonna slay on this thing. This is gonna be great. and then just being, you know, utterly unable to concentrate.
Yep.
And other times thinking, why am I even showing up? And then somehow kind of getting in some kind of groove that would be really amazing.
Yep.
So I think that that becomes more evident on an intensive, like
Yep.
residential retreat. But I just want to reinforce your point that when you're practicing more at home, understanding this is so important.
Yeah, I wanted to riff on that too. My teacher, my meditation teacher, said something really super useful to me because I was complaining about how some days it'd be like, oh wow, I can lift like 400 pounds, and then the next day it's like 100 pounds, and I'm like, I don't get. It's just it was very frustrating. And he said, well, you don't know how much you're lifting. Because there's all kinds of stuff that's unconsciously being rewickered in there that you don't know about. It doesn't present itself into consciousness, and but yet all that stuff is going on. So even if it seems like your meditation isn't so great, that could very well be because your mind's doing other things to prepare yourself for the next meditation to make it actually work.
Yeah, back in the ashram days, the teacher used to say it's like you're digging a tunnel under a mountain, and you're just swinging the pick and swinging the pick, and all these times you want to quit, but you have no idea when is it just one more swing of the pick before you see light. And
Yeah.
again, that's kind of the verified faith piece.
Yes.
So for that 4.5 months of many hours a day, there's a sort of there's a kind of this ongoing display. So the practice was basically just to notice and come back to anchoring in the here and now using breath or something like that.
Yeah, using breath. But so since you brought that point up, the thing that people who might not have experience with meditating that much might not understand is that when you meditate that much, even if you aren't doing some specific practice, it's going to create concentration in the mind that is just sort of automatically going to develop almost no matter what you do. So it's sort of the same effect as going on retreat. There's a container that gets constructed, and even without specific techniques to tighten up that container for the mind, that's still going to develop. And so sitting 4 hours a day, even if you're not quote unquote doing some specific technique, is still going to create concentration and some sense of peace and all that without even really doing anything.
Yes, as one teacher said, if you do something long enough, something's going to happen.
Yes, that's true.
So part of what happens, or what happened for you, is this like a deepening sense of concentration, or more of a gathering, like that gathering of more present moment awareness.
Yeah, so basically there was a container there and there was some level of concentration going on, which, I imagine caused certain parts of the mind to decide that this was safe now to go through all this stuff. And it wanted to do all that. It wanted to process all that stuff through. And so it had the opportunity and, the conditions to do that. And so that's what it did.
So there's an internal state of, we could say, calm,
Yeah.
kind of a state of non-desire, in that you're just simply present. The mind is beginning, like the nature of awareness is beginning to shift a little bit, as it becomes more present moment here. And then there's sort of like a natural kind of like sort of inherent like opening where things begin to shift.
Yep.
Now, would you say that shift, would you say, is there some inherent intelligence behind that?
Yeah, I mean, I suspect it's very much like when you get a cut and that wound heals, it's just doing the repair. And so the mind, I think what is at issue is that usually it does not have the time to do that repair.
Yeah.
It doesn't have the time and conditions in order to do that, especially if there's a lot of damage. And so when those conditions arise, it takes that opportunity to do
Yeah.
something about it, is what I would say.
So just as when you have a broken bone,
Yeah.
you set it and you rest, it knows how to heal. In that same way, when you rest rest the whole mind, body, and presence, that there is some inherent movement toward wholeness.
Yeah, it's
Very, very cool. Very
it's
cool.
repairing itself, and it might seem like that you're the one that's thinking about all that and doing that, but no. It's
So, okay, so we're back to like then what?
okay, so then so all of this calmed down. So I guess the mind decided that it was, it had done what it needed to do for that period of time. And so I thought that so I'm going to use quotes. I thought that I needed more structure and that I wanted to reach higher states. And that's actually what I met a student of Chuladasa's who was teaching TMI. It's the Mind Illuminated, which is actually based on a much older practice called the Elephant Path. So Chuladasa basically took the Elephant Path and he made it more clear to the Western mind, and organized it and structured it and wrote a book about it, which I do highly recommend.
This is the mind illuminated.
The Mind Illuminated
Hmm.
by Chuladasa, or John Yates, I believe is
Yeah.
his name.
And for those who are interested, it's really kind of like it sort of maps out, sort of like the different stages, and and gives you signposts as to where you are along the way, so you can get reference to your subjective experience and where it fits into a larger whole.
That's very true. And I think the other thing that's super helpful about it is that it provides at each stage like exercises that are doable by the mind, and that you can master those particular easy tasks and then move on to another stage where you're doing something a little more difficult. So it's essentially like progressive training. You're starting with things that are very easy. And so the funny thing is people said, a lot of meditation teaching is like, well, just keep your mind on the breath. And it's like, and when it goes away, come back. And that is the teaching, but that's like lifting 1,000-pound deadlift without any you're almost no one can do that. it, it is phenomenally difficult to do that, and so you need some sort of slow progression in order to build up to doing things that are more and more difficult, which seem to be easy, but they're actually very, very difficult things to do.
Yeah, and what I really love about like sort of his map is like first stage is put in your calendar when you're going to sit and sit.
Yes.
It's
That's,
like the very, very foundation is establish a practice.
yep.
And so many of us overlook that.
Yes.
We practice when we think we need it, or we practice when we think we can fit it in. But having that foundation of this is the time I'm dedicating to practice is it's overlooked by many, but it truly is the foundation right
Yep.
there.
Yes. And so I had done a little bit of TMI, or looking at that book and practicing TMI, and I had some level of success with it. I found that to be a very clear practice, but then I got kind of stuck at some point and then kind of discouraged. And so something that I would say is that's very helpful is that if you can find someone who has been all the way down that path, that is super useful, because they can direct you to the end goal, because they actually have gotten there and they've seen it themselves, and they can direct you in the right way. And also they can give you encouragement, because along that path, especially as you get closer to the end, it can get very very, very upsetting. Very, very yes. It is it can be very very frightening and very difficult to proceed if you don't have someone who can help you with that.
So Tracy, this is such juicy stuff, and I'm aware in this segment we have about 10 minutes.
Okay.
And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about, again, you're doing all this at home, and you have a guide, you have like a map you're following, and then you found someone who was further down the path who could guide you. What would you say were like some pivotal moments or pivotal insights that you had? as your path progressed?
Well, so should I just go to the punchline? Is that
Let's go to the punchline, then we can fill in. Yeah.
okay? So I practiced TMI for another 3.5 months. And basically, I reached what I believe most people would call stream entry, which is it is the first, it is a partial enlightenment or partial awakening. And in stream entry, what happens, there's a couple of things that I'll speak to from my own experience. First of all, you realize that there isn't any, I'm just going to just put it out there. There's no free will. There's no volition. There is no I. There is no agency. So all of these things that occur are occurring. And I also want to point out, because people sometimes get very upset about talking about these things explicitly, is that there is nothing special about the person that this happened to. There's nothing special about me. What it is it's very much like a flower blooming. So there's water, there's soil, there's sunlight. The conditions are in place for the blooming to occur. And then it occurs. So what I'm talking about now is something that just occurred. And the thing that occurred is amazing. It's a beautiful flower, but there's no person here that did that. It's all a matter of circumstance and conditions and causes. And this is part of why you want someone who knows about this to help you, because they're part of the cause and condition that helps other people to move along and experience this same thing. So I wanted to get that out of the way, because what I'm going to describe is going to sound very strange. So I'm going to describe what it's like, I think, to awaken. So it's difficult to describe, but I'll try to describe it this way. So I would really like it. It would be wonderful if you could look into my mind and see what's there, because I can't really tell you what's in there. If you could look into my mind, I'm quite certain that you would go, oh, that's what I've always wanted. And that's because it is. It's what is in my mind now is a contentment that we're all looking for. It is a peace, a happiness that we're all looking for, that is causing us to reach for things and grab at things and push things away because we want this thing. And if I could, I would just give that to everyone else, because it's a marvelous thing. It's also a part of the understanding that we're all connected, that I'd like everyone else to have this, because then everyone's experience, this whole unified being would have this whole experience. So that's the best way I could describe it. But you could also say that in this mind now, I can look, and there is a source of happiness. There's a source of peace that's permanently available. It's always there. And that is what awakening is. And what I think people might not understand is that it's permanent, and there's no more effort involved. Like the struggle is gone. It's like downhill. Like you're struggling uphill, and you're not actually struggling, but set that to the side. It seems like there's a struggle, and then it's downhill, and there's some rocks and bumps and stuff. So to be clear, I'm not an arhat, so I'm not at the finish line. There are other things to do with this mind, and there are defilements. So there is desire, there is anger that occasionally arises, although it's only been once in 4 months. So everything gets very easy, everything gets very happy. You want to share this joy with everyone, and that's kind of the punchline of it all. And again, there's no special person that did this. And the reason that I want to share it and I want to do like a video like this is because I want people to understand this is possible.
Yeah.
It's not a myth. It's not unattainable. It doesn't take hundreds of lifetimes. It's entirely doable. So just want to point that out, and I would like other people to experience it. So that's why I talk about these things.
That is so cool. So, one thing I've heard and I've quoted as if I know it to be true, uh, is that like awakening is not about adding anything. It's really about just taking away.
Yeah.
And it seemed like your initial experience was cultivating a sense of like present moment awareness, like as preferenceless as possible. And then, like the releasing of all these traumatic memories and so forth. But over time, less and less of the hindrances, like less and less of, kind of the play of anger, judgment, worry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then a strengthening of whatever that is that's aware of it. Am I right there?
Uh, I would describe it a little bit differently.
Yeah, please do. Okay.
So, what happens is that concentration builds, you're developing strong concentration. And I think one mistake that people make is that the concentration is the goal, that the jhana is the goal, or the
Right.
pleasant experience is the goal. And that is not true. That is just the jhana, or the concentration is a tool. And what happens when that tool gets developed is that um, you can see things that were not apparent before. So, one thing that becomes very apparent is that there is no volition, that there is no. So, right now, when I'm talking to you, my hands moving, my voice, I'm saying words and stuff. It's very apparent to me that I'm not choosing, there's no I that's choosing to do that. And it's actually very obvious because there's no time for that to occur. There's no time for an I to make a decision, to make all these movements, to say all these words. There's no time for it. However, the mind creates the illusion, a backfill, and says, oh, yes, I did that. I did that. I did that. And it becomes very apparent that that isn't true. And it makes a lot of things more obvious. So it becomes very difficult to maintain anger at someone else because you realize that even when people do bad things, that's the only thing they could do at that time. There's no volition. They're just whatever causes and conditions have existed up to that point to cause whatever is occurring causes whatever it is to occur. There's not a personal being in there that's doing the bad. There are bad things that are being done, and I'm not saying that you should not recognize that, but there is no person that's doing it. There's no person to be angry
Yeah.
about them doing that. So
Yeah.
lots of things after this sort of realization, plus you get the big happy thing in your head, and all of that actually starts leading you downhill to more peace and more joy and more kindness and more generosity. All of these things continue to build because of that sort of that one thing that flips.
Mm.
Once that flips, it's like I said, it's kind of a downhill thing after that.
Wow.
And the other thing I would say is that from the inside, it's very apparent. Like before this happened, there was depression, there was cloudy skies, it was dark. And now I would describe it as bright sunny days with occasional clouds. And there's no possible way that there's some sort of Tracy that could have flipped a switch to cause that to occur. That was just a training over time that managed to reach a point where the brain just decided, oh, I can just rewire all this stuff and it doesn't have to be this way. It just decides that, and then it does it. It took like 3 days in my case for that to happen, and then after that, it was like it's like a new operating system. It's very apparent. And it's permanent. So if you have like jhanic states and you're on retreat and stuff, and you have these wonderful experiences, first of all, I'll say those really aren't as good as the end goal. But you might think that they're the end goal, but then they go away, right? You go off a retreat and you're not meditating, and then all the stuff comes back, and that doesn't happen when the switch flips. it flips, the light goes on, and then the light's always on, and there's occasional things that pass through the light, but there's always a background of this. It's always in the background, this joy and
Mm.
happiness.
Wow. So, well, thank you, Tracy. I think so many people are drawn to meditation for different, different levels. For some people, it's like, oh, maybe this will help with my indigestion,
Ah,
or so and so looks happier, I'll try that. Or, it's, there's sort of like the spiritual shopping, But then I truly believe that when you stay with it, like there is this beginning of where we're sensing something inherently powerful in this, and there's so many words, that point the way. But what you've been describing is like really giving yourself to it fully experientially, you know.
yeah, I mean, it once you, yeah, like I said, and you do. I will say that there are specific things that you need to do because people meditate for years. I meditated for years and years, and I had some experiences, but you need to develop a huge amount of concentration, and then you need to have insights which are essentially like aha moments, but like really big. And then it's the unconscious. The other point that I'll make is the conscious mind doesn't really matter very much. It's all the unconscious parts that need to be convinced that what is true. And then when that happens, then it all just falls into place, and you're not having to struggle to try to feel better, or it's just it all naturally is in place because the whole mind system has unified and decided that this is what it's going to do. So,
Yeah, yeah.
and there's no there's no volition in any of that.
The part of it, and I appreciate you are kind of articulating these states because, you know, when we're when we're kind of like listening with the mind, like whenever I hear anyone kind of describe like, like the inner states of presence and the inner states of, of like really deep abiding wisdom and what arises in the realm of compassion is it's really hard to not sound like you're stoned, you know,
Yeah, yeah.
because you're really describing, we're trying to find words that are describing something that is essentially beyond words.
Well, not only that, I'll add one more component is something that surprised me about all this is it's totally weird. Like it's unbelievable to me. To me, this is unbelievable and makes no sense. This was like 4 months ago that this happened to me, and it still doesn't, it's more normalized for me. But the fact that I'd be happy in some sort of permanent way it makes no sense at all.
Yeah. Well, it also speaks to, and I know we're over time here a little bit, but it speaks so powerfully to the power of associated with like-minded people.
Yes,
Which is
very much.
why there have been, the formation of special communities because, you know, we in many ways we have to do the work alone, but there's something about the power of being with those who share like a passion and discipline and experience where we can learn from each other.
Yeah, and so we are influencing each other in ways that we do not control and do not understand. And that's because there's no self that's actually controlling any of it. So as a result, the people that you're associating with are influencing you, you're influencing them. And if you choose those wisely, which I know that's a contradiction, but that's a useful fiction, then that does make things progress more quickly and in a more pleasant direction.
That is great. Well, thank you so much. And I know that, many traditions speak about like, if you really want to go somewhere, make sure you have a map, and I just really kind of want to honor kind of the system, the context in which you've been practicing. And I'll include that information, kind of in the show notes for those who are interested.
Oh, and I just wanted to be clear that there are other ways to get there. So some people spontaneously awaken. That's entirely possible. It's just that there are more systematic ways of doing it, I guess you could
Yeah, exactly,
say.
exactly. It's like I was just sharing in another talk about how what I've always loved is how many people will say this is the direct path, you know. Devotion is the direct path. Training the mind is the direct path. Selfless service is the direct path. And we're all determining what is the direct path for us. And I
Yeah,
so
that's true.
appreciate your articulation of this.
Yeah, so if you have one of those scientific minds, this kind of approach might be might work for you, whereas a devotional one would work for someone who has a different, a different view of things.
Well, and I would recommend anyone who's interested in practice, you know, as you're determining what your path is, to take a really good look at the Mind Illuminated, because it really does. It's such there's such powerful pointing out instructions that can't not be helpful no matter what your temperament.
Oh, I should point out I have no affiliation with this either, and don't. there's
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 no
no money involved for me,
there's,
and
there's no affiliated link.
I'm just happy. I'm just happy if this helps other people because that's what I want other people to have.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much, Tracy. I'm really, really feel blessed to have your time and your
This has been
presence.
great. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Great. Thank you.
All right, take care.